All right.
Okay.
I love preparing for the last two courses because it's my world, Bible, old and new. Today we're stepping a little bit out of the Bible world and into history. Now, history is one of my deep loves. In undergrad, my concentration was church history, but not necessarily church history of 1800s to the 21st century in the U.S. So it was, if you ask me about church parents, church fathers and mothers, I'd be happy to answer questions about that. Here we got a lot of, it's a whole different world. So I'm going to be outlining the class topic today is immigration history and the USA. And I'm going to be outlining then the church's historical response. So what happened? How did the church respond? Is that clear? All right. And again, this is part of the 4-part series. Your outline, in comparison to the last 2 weeks where we did Old Testament, New Testament, and we had Hebrew words, etc. This time, I'm giving you the outline of the history. I'll be going through my script. So what happens in kind of each time frame. If you look at page 2, and sorry for not numbering it, you'll see kind of the key takeaway I'm hoping we'll get today. The church alternates between prophetic welcome and complicity, right? We've been doing this even with the Old and New Testament courses, right? We're not just looking at texts that are affirming. We also looked at texts that may not have been affirming and how God responds, right? So we're doing some critical analysis. Here, I'm going to do the same thing. How did the church respond by welcome? How did the church respond with complicity? And I would hope that you would hear that we are called to consistent Christ-centered hospitality. Hospitality, as you know from the Old and New Testament courses, we're building upon what does it mean to be a people that welcome. And if you want a scripture memory to memorize, I was a stranger and you welcomed me. From Matthew 25, if you recall, this is where Christ says, when they asked him, where were you? I was when you fed the one who was hungry, the one who was naked, right? As I said in my announcements about Bethel farm workers, Matthew 25, when we care for those at the margins, Matthew 25 reminds us we're caring for Christ's self. And so then pages 2 and 3, right? This is kind of my script to some extent. So every part of my script, you'll see actual links you're welcome to visit where I'm drawing this information from. Once you're done with that, that section of course sources and working links, I've included books, kind of like a bibliography of books and academic studies you're welcome to look into if you want to learn more. Of course, the key government and legal documents. The back page might be more interesting to you, which is the church statements and archives, both what maybe those outside of the PCUSA have said, our Catholic siblings, our evangelical siblings with the evangelical immigration table, etc. And then, of course, articles and reports that may be of interest to you. So today we'll do immigration history and the church's response. Next week, we'll do more of the current immigration system as we have it. So visa caps, how does one get in the process of becoming a citizen? And then, of course, highlighting some of the stories happening today. So we'll look at that for next week. So a little bit of the objectives for today. We'll overview the history all the way through colonial times through 2022. We'll examine how the churches responded in each era. Again, sometimes offering welcoming and advocacy, at other times exclusion and complicity. We'll highlight key laws and events and how Catholic, evangelical, mainline Protestant, specifically Presbyterian communities reacted. I also want to emphasize before I begin that I am purposely avoiding a partisan bias. Immigration policy, friends, including deportations, have been pursued by both major parties. Okay? Our goal is to have an honest, nuanced reflection grounded in our faith and historical facts. Right? Let's begin with early colonial era and the foundations. So beginning with the 1600s to the 1700s, early European settlers, imagine the Puritans in New England, were themselves immigrant, often seeking, as we know, religious freedom. They were welcomed by varying degrees by our indigenous siblings, the Native Americans at first, yet we know that tragically, many colonists later displaced the indigenous people of this nation, of this land. Early on, there was no formal, quote-unquote, immigration law that existed. Colonies were open to those European settlers, and as we know, later on, enslaved Africans being brought against their will, right? No, quote-unquote, immigration law. In a church context, many early immigrants framed their journey in religious terms, right? Pilgrims saw the U.S. as a haven, or the U.S. land, that later became the U.S. land, as a haven. The colonial church often supported these settlers' endeavor, sometimes seeing the New World as their mission field. However, Christians also wrestled with ethical treatment of others. For instance, some like William Penn's Quakers, they advocated for fair treatment of natives, while other colonial Christians justified taking land or excluding those of different faiths. Okay? In 1790, the first U.S. Naturalization Act, 1790, right, after the birth of the nation, quote unquote, which restricts citizenship to, quote, free white persons. That non-whites, including African slaves, Native Americans, later down the road Asians, are excluded from citizenship. And here's a church note. The young American churches generally did not oppose these racial restrictions. Many were themselves divided by racial lines. And this silence set a precedent of the church that often reflected cultural biases rather than challenging them.
I have a question.
Yes.
We didn't have slavery at that time, did we? But we had indentured servants.
What do you mean? I'm sorry.
Well, when it says free white persons, did they consider an indentured servant free?
So yes, this would not include any person of color, and that it was specifically limited to white people. That you could become a citizen.
I'm talking about free versus indentured.
Yeah, would indentures be able to become citizens? Is that your question?
Yeah.
Yes. Since they're not enslaved, I feel like the answer might be yes, but I'm not sure
No.
of the nuance there. Right, and you could even see that we're already beginning in the 1790s, when that bill was passed, the beginning of a construction of white. Right, because we know that Irish Americans did not like Italian Americans. We'll get into that, right? Whiteness as a construct is created. Free whites could become citizens. All right, 19th century immigration and nativism. In the 1840s through 1850s, we see a huge influx of Irish, and in parentheses, Catholic, right? Irish Catholic, famine refugees, and German immigrants. There was a nativist backlash that occurs, the anti-Catholic riots, the quote-unquote know-nothing political party that sought to curb Catholic influence. And then the church responds, there was Catholic parishes that multiplied to serve those immigrant faithful, While some Protestants and Protestant clergy specifically, they begin to feel fear of papist, quote unquote, papist immigrants, right? So start using these labels for others. This era tested inter-Christian charity, so like ecumenical relationships, inter-Christian charity. Many Protestants failed at this, viewing Catholic immigrants as a threat. Those papist immigrants. And then there was mass migration waves. In the 19th century, the US saw major immigration waves. Through the 1860s, through the 1870s, Chinese immigrants arrived in the West, right? So think California Gold Rush, think the Transcontinental Railroad, and they faced brutal discrimination and violence. The church, there was pockets of support that emerged. For example, there's a Presbyterian missionary called William Spear, who defended Chinese immigrants and even founded a Chinese church in San Francisco. Yet many American Christians accepted and even endorsed anti-Chinese sentiment. By 1880, 105,000 Chinese people lived in the US, alongside millions of European immigrants. These newcomers often faced hostility from the public, which then you get the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. This is the first major federal immigration law that targeted a specific group. It banned Chinese immigration and barred Chinese residents from citizenship. This, we know, was driven by racial prejudice, economic fears, despite Chinese workers' contributions to building railroads. The church's response. Do I need to hold this a little closer to this? Is that better?
No, you're fine.
Oh, you're fine? Okay. Except when that happens.
Alex, do you know why the Germans came and why so many Europeans were coming? What were they coming from in Europe?
There's a handful of things that are well, and the story tends to be the same, right? Persecution, you're fleeing, famine, you're fleeing, right? There's echoes of even what we see in the scriptures. You're fleeing something, or you're fleeing, or you're going for opportunity, right? For example, the Irish, you had the potato famine.
Yeah,
Right.
That I knew.
Yeah. So there's a whole range of reasons. Some of it is for, again, that religious freedom. Some of it is for opportunity. There's a whole range of reasons why they're coming. Okay, Chinese Exclusion Act, you see some positive responses. For example, not all Christians agreed with the blatant xenophobia of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Reverend William Spear, a Presbyterian minister, right? Ministered to Chinese immigrants in San Francisco and publicly opposed anti-Chinese legislation in the 1850s. He founded, as I already said, a Chinese Presbyterian Church in 1853 and argued against prejudice using, again, the prejudice was using biblical and economic reasoning. Such advocacy by someone like Reverend Spear was grounded in seeing Chinese immigrants as neighbors, as fellow child of God, right?
Alex, were the Naturalization Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act, were they ever rescinded? Does anybody know? I mean, I can.
That's a great question, yeah. Were they ever rescinded? Maybe they were just defeated in court, because I think we'll get to some of those elements later.
Okay.
Yeah. Hold on to that question, yeah. Here are some negative church responses to the Exclusion Act. At the same time, there was many Protestants who supported nativist ideas. In the late 1800s and the early 1900s, some mainline Protestants and evangelicals even promoted immigration restrictions, those restrictions that excluded Asians and certain European Catholics/Jews in an effort to preserve, and I quote, a Protestant America. Anti-Catholic and racist attitudes were common. For instance, the 1880s through the 1920s saw groups like the American Protective Association, which is an anti-Catholic group, and the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK, using Christian language to justify hostility towards immigrants. And part of the results, part of the church was complicit in or silent about unjust policies, like again, the Chinese exclusion, and then later, the severe 1924 national origins quotas. Even as, of course, we hear other Christians spoke up for the oppressed. That's a clock's not helpful, is it? Okay, early 20th century. Early 20th century and refugees. Ellis Island era. We know the Ellis Island era, the Statue of Liberty. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants entered the U.S., including 4 million Italians and 2 million Eastern European Jews. This sparked the, quote, Great Wave, and also a nativist backlash leading to the Quota Acts. The Quota Acts of 1921 and 1924 that severely limited immigration from those southern Eastern European areas and banning most Asians. There was many Protestants that endorsed these restrictive laws. The church outreach, yet other Christians actively welcomed immigrants. By the late 1800s, ministries formed to help newcomers integrate. For example, the YMCA, yes, the Young Men's Christian Association, began offering English class as early as 1856 for German immigrants. In 1903, the YMCA created the Department for Immigrants, a legacy that continues in today's adult ESL and refugee programs. Likewise, there's Catholic parishes and cities that establish schools and charities for the waves of Irish, Polish, Italian, and other Catholic immigrants that provided community support when there was and broader society was still hostile. That even as national policy became exclusive, many local churches offered charity and continued that community engagement in arriving immigrants, a quiet but really important ministry. After World War I and the refugee aid that comes, fast forward to the 1940s, after World War I, after World War II as well, Europe had millions of displaced people, and of course, as we know, Holocaust survivors. The U.S. passed its first refugee law in 1948. And churches were instrumental in resettling refugees. Catholic and Protestant congregations lobbied for refugee admissions and sponsored families, partnering with the government to welcome those fleeing war. This was a positive witness Christians saw welcoming a stranger as a gospel mandate and helped these refugees start a new life. As we know, there was varied responses. Note that the church did not uniformly embrace all immigrants at first. For instance, in the 1930s, about 400,000 to 1 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans were forcibly repatriated, deported during the Great Depression, largely to free up jobs. Few spoke up then in defense of those families. However, by the mid-century, attitudes were shifting. When Jewish and Eastern European refugees needed help post-World War II, American Christians rallied to welcome the stranger, quote unquote, laying groundwork for the U.S. refugee resettlement system. I want us to acknowledge there was a mix of responses. When we enter the mid-20th century, I call this section Mexican Labor, Land, and Law. I think many of us know that the American Southwest was part of Mexico. We know this, right? Okay, good. Our school system is doing well. Until the mid-19th century. After the U.S.-Mexican War, which happens in 1848, Mexican residents in annexed lands become a marginalized minority in the U.S. Families in New Mexico, Texas, California had generations deep ties to that land. I remember I met the bishop of the Episcopalian Church in Pennsylvania, and he was Mexican American, but it was back, I think, like 8 generations, because his family, 4 generations, like in New Mexico before it was New Mexico, right? It was before just part of Mexico. So there's so many people, families that had generation deep ties in that land. This history means that migration across the U.S.-Mexico border often involved people returning to regions their ancestors had lived in for centuries. There was, of course, that connection to land. Mexico had 12 plus generations of people in those territories before they even became U.S. soil, establishing a legitimate ancient connection to this land. And then we get the beginning of Mexican labor programs. During World War II, the U.S. launched the Bracero program. Has anybody heard of this program?
Say it again.
Bracero, B-R-A-C-E-R-O. From 1942 through 1964, this Bracero program brought guest workers from Mexico to fill the farm labor shortages. Over 22 years, about 4.5 million labor contracts were issued. These workers harvested crops for low wages, often under exploitative conditions. They promised housing, fair pay, and insurance, which were frequently denied. And after the war, cheap labor demand continued, and many Mexican workers stayed or crossed, quote unquote, illegally as the program ended. I'm going to use a slur, and I'm going to acknowledge that I'm using that, because this is what the bill was called, Operation Wetback, in 1954. Under President Eisenhower, the INS carried out mass deportation of Mexican immigrants, again, officially named Operation Wetback, which swept up at least 1.1 to 1.3 million people in 1954. Border Patrol agents, backed by military equipment, raided those Latinx neighborhoods, even detaining some U.S. citizens of Mexican descent in a dragnet. It was the largest deportation action in U.S. history at that time. Notably, a few spoke up on behalf of immigrants during these 1950s roundups. But the silence of most church leaders and churches and civic leaders then is now seen as a moral failing, a contrast to later eras when churches would protest with tactics. How did some of the church respond to Mexican labor and deportations? Fortunately, in the 1950s, there was little organized church protest against this operation and its harsh methods. Some Catholic clergy in the Southwest provided basic pastoral care to deported families or spoke quietly about the abuses, but there was no national religious outcry at the time. The Catholic Church, for instance, was still integrating its own ethnic Mexican American members and had not yet become a vocal advocate on immigration justice, a stance that they would later develop. On a positive note, in the 1960s, the church began taking stands for Hispanic migrants' rights. The United Farm Workers movement between the 60s and the 70s, led by Cesar Chavez, yes,
These are-
a devout Catholic. I was taught this in California, and I was surprised that they don't teach California history in New Jersey when I asked my wife about it.
When did
That you-
Cesar- when did Cesar Chavez start his?
The United Farm Workers movement, 60s through 70s, like led by Cesar Chavez, yeah, and many others. Like every movement, there's a lot of women who are involved, but we remember some of those men. So Cesar Chavez saw support from priests, Catholic sisters, Protestant ministers, in advocating for migrant farm workers' dignity. Church groups started recognizing the migrant laborers were their siblings in Christ. For example, Catholic Bishop Joseph Donnelly in California celebrated masses with farm worker strikers, and some mainline Protestant agencies raised funds for farm worker families. These were early steps towards the church's later, more robust advocacy for immigrant rights. I also want to talk a little bit about land and faith. Understanding that land history can inform faith perspectives. Many Mexican Americans during this time didn't cross the border. The border crossed them. How does land history inform our understanding of immigration when the border crosses you? All right, moving on, 20th century, late 20th century, 1980s, refugees, sanctuary, and reform. They began to get some immigration law changes. In the 1965 Immigration Act ended the old quota system, opening doors to non-European immigrants. And by the 1980s, many newcomers were arriving from Latin America and Asia. Two key developments of the 1980s, the Central American refugee crisis, and then the major immigration reform of 1986. The sanctuary movement really started in the 1980s. During the early 1980s, civil wars in El Salvador and Guatemala drove nearly 1 million refugees north to the U.S. border. U.S. policy denied many of these asylum claims, viewing them through the Cold War lens. And from the World Relief Organization, less than 3% approval rate.
Alex, our church needs to remember that we were part of the refugee program and we took in a refugee family.
Our church was part of a refugee program and we took refugees in. Yes, thank you. And I didn't write this in here, but I'll take a moment to say this. The Central American refugee crisis that happens in the 80s, when I was in seminary, we had a conference. This was in 2016 when we were having another immigration crisis then too. We called the conference, led by the Herencia Lecture Series, which means Herencia Legacy. Am I right in thinking that? Yeah, something close to that. And we called it Reaping What We Sow because we had these scholars talk about the immigration crisis happening, but they took us back into the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. If you may be familiar with CIA, governmental actions that happen in Central America, displacing dictators, encouraging the right person to be in government. When you take from lands and their resources, why would you not expect that people would come to? When you start stripping land of things you need, right? Why would you not expect people that would come to? Which is why we call the lecture series Reaping What We Sowed. When we're taking from land all these resources, why would we not expect that these immigrants are going to come to where those resources now are? at the start of the Civil War, 80% of the land was owned by 20% of the people in El Salvador, right? So there's a lot of geopolitical stuff happening. This is why there's also part of the theological teachings that happen at seminaries. They really use anti-empire faith often, because this is what's happening in the New Testament, right? The cross is an an empire's tool of violence and naming, what's going to happen to you if you, right? Because the cross is only for those who are usurpers, insurrectionists. How do we live in anti-empire faith when we live in a country like the U.S. that at times has components that get engaged in other countries in a colonial way? And then what do we do when we strip places of their resources and then people start coming too?
Weren't there a lot of American businesses like the banana companies and so on in Central America?
Was there not also a lot of businesses? Yeah.
And
The coffee business, yeah. I mean,
they own property, right?
yeah. Who drank a cup of coffee this morning? Did you get your beans from North Dakota? Okay. All right. So we get the Central American refugee crisis, the immigration reform of '86. Here, I'm losing my spot. And responses, the churches sprang into action, like our own. Thank you for raising that history reminder. Hundreds of congregations, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist, Lutheran, Baptist, Quaker, Jewish, etc. So not just Christian organizations, publicly declared themselves sanctuaries, offering shelter and legal help to Central American refugees. At its height, over 500 U.S. congregations were part of that 1980s sanctuary movement, openly defying federal immigration authorities out of a sense of a higher moral law. It's a word that we use all the time, right? Sanctuary. Let us be a sanctuary, pure and holy. We say this word all the time. Back in the day, if your church had a red door and you were running from persecution, etc., you knew that place you could find sanctuary. Food, shelter, a chance, right? I had a good deal professor who said, if I ever end up being in a different country and I end up being hungry and somehow ran out of food, passport was stolen, I'm going to go find a place that has a red door, knowing I'll find sanctuary there, right? We call this our sanctuary, but it's the place of, as I said today, where you belong, where your story finds a home, right? So they take this word of sanctuary in the 1980s and really begin to openly defy federal immigration authorities out of a sense of a higher moral law. For example, in the Presbyterian world, the movement's co-founders included Reverend John Fife, the pastor of Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson. He and others illegally transported refugees from the border to safe churches, saying their Christian faith compelled them to protect the vulnerable, citing verses like Matthew 25:35. They risked arrest. Indeed, Fife and several others were indicted by the U.S. Justice Department in 1986 for, quote, harboring illegal aliens, end quote. Despite this, the movement persisted, grounded in biblical principles of sanctuary, analogous to those ancient cities of refuge, if you remember the Old Testament course. Many mainline Protestant denominations officially endorsed or tolerated sanctuary actions. The PCUSA passed resolutions supporting refugees, asylum, and some local presbyteries declared sanctuary status. This was a bold, positive witness of the church siding with the oppressed.
Who was president in 80 and 86?
Reagan. Sanctuary, yeah, and just so you know, my family, which my mom is here, was hoping to get, my father was the youngest of 6. So all his brothers were in the US before the 1986 act that closed the borders a bit more. So he was able to get a religious work visa, not here, because that was denied, but in Canada, fleeing the Civil War in El Salvador. So that's why I was born in Calgary, Alberta. Oh, okay. So
what's this IRCA?
we'll get right there. Sanctuary activists, the outcome is that sanctuary activists not only saved lives, but they began to influence policy, right? Their advocacy built the pressure that contributed to the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act, known as IRCA. IRCA, signed by President Reagan, a Republican, granted legal amnesty to 3 million undocumented immigrants and improved temporary worker programs. There's a really interesting clip you should Google. George H.W. Bush and Reagan on a debate stage, talking about debating around immigrants, and they're debating on how we should best care for immigrants, right? Right. I'm not partisan. Like, people talked about how do we best care across the stage. It's really interesting. Go look at that clip. They're arguing who can do the best at being careful, at showing hospitality for immigrants. The World Relief, a Christian agency, which my whole script is filled with a lot of their stuff, notes that the sanctuary movement's moral pressure helped push Reagan to accept legalization as part of the IRCA, and that churches rejoiced at the amnesty, seeing many of their undocumented parishioners emerging from the shadows, right? This is a legal question. And now when the legality was changed, they emerged from the shadows. IRCA also, just so you know, added employer penalties for hiring unauthorized workers. And that was something that church leaders did have mixed feelings about, as they fear it could lead to discrimination against Hispanic workers. So we get very church reaction. While most church bodies in the 80s supported compassion and reform, there was, of course, dissenting voices. Some more conservative evangelicals and Catholics felt law should not be defied. They were uneasy with civil disobedience in sanctuary. A few warned that churches might be abetting law breaking, but the dominant Christian response in this era, in the 80s, was mercy and advocacy. We must obey God rather than men was a common refrain. You can hear echoes of learning from the civil rights movement and from Dr. King, who of course is also echoing St. Augustine. An unjust law is no law at all, he states in The City of God, which Dr. King then states in his letter from Birmingham jail. And you see echoes like that here. We must obey God rather than men. Catholic bishops in 1985 explicitly resolved that immigration reform must include mercy and legalization for the undocumented. And you can see we start using the language of undocumented, right? Because nobody's status is illegal. That's a law definition. Who they are is just undocumented, but there's no such thing as an illegal human being. Does that make sense? You are you don't have papers, but there's no such thing as being in your being and identity illegal. Undocumented. Evangelicals too begin to reconsider their stance. Again, we see organizations like World Relief and the National Association of Evangelicals by the late 80s were calling for more just treatment of immigrants and refugees, a notable shift for groups that had been relatively quiet before. And again, all these, you'll hear learners begin to identify in the sanctuary movement, etc., biblical mandates. You start identifying those mandates like sanctuary cities in the Old Testament, if you remember the first class, the love of neighbor, behind this courageous chapter in church history. In 1990s, enforcement and the bipartisan paradox is what I call this. The Clinton era, Democrat from 93 to 01, the 1990s saw economic boom, but also rising, quote unquote, illegal immigration. President Bill Clinton implemented tough border enforcement. We get Operation Gatekeeper in 1994, which doubled Border Patrol agents and built new fencing near San Diego, effectively militarizing the border, according to some critics. The crackdowns pushed migrant crossings into more, right, because you're building walls. So the crossings begin to be pushed towards more dangerous desert roads, and thousands of migrants died over the ensuing years trying to just enter. Clinton then signed the 1996 immigration laws, the IRA and the AEDPA, which included deportations, expanded the grounds for removal, and limited due process for immigrants. These laws were passed with bipartisan support amid a climate, if you recall that era, of tough on crime and welfare reform politics. And the result was that deportations and detentions surged in the late 90s, affecting many long-settled immigrant families. Right? If you change a law that it's going to be a little bit more strict, you can imagine how this then increases the surge of deportations and detentions. In the 90s, there were many religious groups that grew alarmed at the harsher policies. The Catholic Church at that time, under Pope John Paul II, under his influence, emphasized the dignity of migrants. U.S. Catholic bishops in 1996 spoke out against the legislation that eroded immigrant rights, though these protests got little public attention at the time. Mainline Protestant denominations like the Presbyterians, Methodists, and Lutherans issued statements urging compassion over exclusion. For instance, the Peace USA in the late 90s called for a comprehensive reform that balanced law with mercy. However, these voices had limited impact on policy in that charged post-Cold War environment. Y'all remember that? Charged post-Cold War environment. As we bridge into the 2000s, we begin to see some shifting views, specifically some shifting evangelical views. Interestingly, by the early 2000s, even evangelical Christians, traditionally associated with conservative politics, began to advocate for a humane immigration policy. This shift was partly due to demographic changes. You begin to see growing Latino membership and evangelical churches and Bible rediscovery. In 2003, the Southern Baptist Convention, historically white and conservative, passed a resolution urging ministry to immigrants, and support for immigrant families. Evangelical leaders formed coalitions to push for reform, again citing Scripture's call to welcome the stranger. This laid groundwork for broader Christian support of comprehensive immigration reform in the 2000s, even transcending some partisan lines. There's a quick discussion data point I want to share in terms of enforcement. Clinton, which is a Democrat, and George W. Bush, a Republican, both deported large numbers of people, again showing that immigration crackdowns are bipartisan. In the 2000 to 2010s, immigration in a polarized age. Bush era, as we know, Republican from 01 to 09. After 9/11, national security fears reshaped immigration policies. President George Bush created the Department of Homeland Security and ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, in 2003. While focused on terrorism, this also ramped up interior immigration enforcement. Deportations steadily rose throughout the 2000s, yet Bush also championed a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. He pushed a bipartisan comprehensive immigration reform bill in 2006/2007, which ultimately failed in Congress. During those efforts, a remarkable religious alliance emerged. Catholic bishops, mainline Protestants, evangelicals united in support of immigration reform, of compassionate reform. In 2006, there was massive pro-immigrant marches across the U.S. that saw priests, pastors, lay people marching together, carrying banners like "Hear the Cry of the Poor." The Evangelical Immigration Table, a coalition of prominent evangelical leaders, formed to lobby Republicans in particular, emphasizing biblical principles of human dignity, family unity, and rule of law balanced with mercy. This was a notable positive development, Christians across traditions finding common ground to advocate for just immigration laws. In the Obama era, 09 through 17, President Barack Obama promised reform but faced gridlock. Under his watch,
Last 2 years.
he had 2 years. Under his watch, even in light of the gridlock, because he had 2 years, under his watch, deportations reached record highs. Over 3 million people removed during 2009 to 2016, earning Obama the uneasy nickname Deporter-in-Chief, even from immigration activists. Deporter-in-Chief, even from immigration activists. This again underscores that strict enforcement spanned both parties. However, Obama also initiated, if you recall, DACA, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals in 2012, which by executive action protected young immigrants, quote unquote, the dreamers, from deportation. Churches widely praised DACA and DAPA, that came down later. Many congregations had Dreamer used in their pews and saw this as a justice issue. The Catholic bishops, the PCUSA, among others, urged Congress to make DACA permanent. In 2013, a comprehensive reform bill actually passed the Senate with bipartisan support, buoyed by intense advocacy from faith groups. Catholic University presidents sent Congress a letter declaring, "We are part of an immigrant church in an immigrant nation." Right, recall the 1800s. And 90 plus evangelical and Catholic leaders jointly reminded legislators, my goodness, that no human being, quote, no human being made in God's image is illegal. Ultimately, that bill stalled in the House, but the effort showed unprecedented Christian consensus. Then we see the Trump era from 2017 to 2021, a Republican. President Donald Trump ran on that hardline immigration platform. In office, he issued a controversial travel ban in 2017, barring entry from several Muslim-majority countries, prompting many church leaders to protest it as a religious discrimination. He drastically cut refugee admissions to the lowest in modern history. In 2018, family separations at the border under the zero tolerance policy shocked Christian communities. A crescendo of criticism rose among religious leaders when thousands of children were being taken from their parents. Do you all recall this? The kids in cages. Catholic bishops even called family separation immoral. And even conservative evangelical figures, for example, Franklin Graham, denounced it as publicly as disgraceful. Terrible to see families ripped apart. Virtually every major Christian denomination, Catholic, Orthodox, mainline Protestant, evangelical, black churches, etc., signed letters or held vigils urging the administration to stop separating families. This near unanimous faith outcry helped pressure an eventual end to the practice. On other issues, some white evangelical Christians did support Trump's call for stricter enforcement in the border wall, seeing as maintaining law and order. But the institutional church voice was largely in favor of human treatment. For example, the Southern Baptist Convention in 2018 affirmed the need for secure borders and compassion. Compassion for immigrants. Catholic Charities mobilized to assist children in detention. This era tested the church's commitment to nonpartisanship. many leaders found themselves in opposition to policies of a president favored by a large segment of evangelicals.
When they separated those children, they did not keep good records. And if you go online, they will tell you how many children still have never been reunited with those parents. They deported the parents, they didn't keep track of some of the villages, the names wherever the parents went.
Yeah, so when kids were separated from their families, we did not keep good record of where they were going, how many were never reunited. I was going to talk about this next week, but immigration law, immigration court system is very different than, you're not given the guaranteed right of a lawyer in the immigration court world. So for example, we've seen that even today, the funding for lawyers for kids, right? Kids who are detained for their cases, there's up to now even 4-year-olds who don't speak English, who don't know immigration law, having to defend themselves at immigration court. Yeah, the children tend to be the most affected by some of these laws sometimes. I'm going to keep going. The Biden era. I'm stopping at 2022, like I said. President Joe Biden promised a more humane approach. Upon taking office in 2021, he immediately reversed certain Trump policies, halting border wall construction, attempting to end the travel ban, raising the refugee cap again, and promising a sweeping reform bill with citizenship path. However, Biden also faced record numbers of migrants, including unaccompanied minors, at the border in 2021. The pandemic era health policy, Title 42, that allowed rapid expulsion of border crossers remained in effect through 2022, meaning many asylum seekers were turned away without a hearing. Biden's administration, while aiming for compassion, continued to enforce deportations and detentions, though, of course, at a lower scale initially than Obama or Trump. For example, ICE still deported tens of thousands in 2021 and 2022, and when border holding facilities overflowed with children, the administration reopened some of the very detention centers it had criticized. This, of course, illustrates the complexity and inertia of the system. The church's stance. Faith leaders have continued to advocate in the Biden era, pushing for comprehensive reform and an end to harmful policies. In 2021, as the U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan and later when war erupted in Ukraine, churches again took lead in welcoming refugees, organizing sponsorship for Afghan families and Ukrainian refugees. Meanwhile, denominations urged Biden to address root causes of migration humanely and not just rely on expulsions. In essence, the church's recent posture has been consistent across administrations. Uphold the dignity of migrants, keep families together, treat asylum seekers fairly, and remind both parties that immigrants are people, not political pawns. As one Catholic teaching notes, the more prosperous nations are obliged, to the extent that they are able, to welcome the foreigner in search of security and livelihood. Churches today invoke such principles when calling for bipartisan solutions rather than partisan point scoring. Looking over this timeline, you can see that the church witness has evolved at times. We've seen moments of courageous solidarity, sanctuary, refugee resettlement, moments of complicity or silence, Chinese exclusion, 1950s deportations. And it makes me curious, what lessons can we as a church learn from historical responses as we face as we face, there you go, immigration issues today. In what ways are we called to be, for those who know the passage, salt and light on this issue today? Some of the key takeaways, friends, and I'll open it to questions. Immigration laws have always been part of the American story to some extent. Churches have played varied roles. I will stress that both political parties have acted both welcoming and harshly. In the church's role, I would hope and pray to consistently apply Christ-centered principles and not shift, as you can see this happens at times, with partisan winds.
What is the status of sanctuary cities at the moment?
Great, so we'll open it up to questions. What is the status of immigration cities, sanctuaries at the moment? So it wasn't an official law. It was part of policies that ICE was told by internal policies, you do not enter sanctuaries, places of worship. That was just, you can see that that's a little bit of a remnant from the 80s when they were doing this against the law, and then it kind of became an official policy. It's also not good optics. If you're going to go grab an immigrant and you break into a church, doesn't look good, right? So it was always part of ICE's policies for a very long time. You don't enter sanctuaries, which is why like 2016 to 2020s, there was even some PCUSA churches that served as sanctuary places, quote unquote, because they knew ICE couldn't go in. So what they were doing, they were having services that lasted 24/7, 365. And someone would be reading the Bible or something. You would have volunteers come in and they would just read scripture 24/7, 365 days a year, so that people who are at risk for deportation went into these spaces, found literally a sanctuary from their situation, and could stay there safely, be fed, go to sleep, while there's a 24/7 worship service happening. That policy has now since been rescinded. I want to say this was just a few months ago. So now ICE can go into any place, even of worship.
What about schools?
Same thing.
Isn't San Francisco a sanctuary city?
Isn't San Francisco a sanctuary city? So when people say that in this era, now that, right, sanctuary spaces, like even sanctuary churches are no longer, like people can come in. When cities say that, more often what they mean is that their police department, their governmental structures will not work and or collaborate with ICE, with CBP, right? This is something that we could even ask Sarasota Police Department. Will you commit to not? From my understanding, they have committed to working and collaborating with ICE to make sure things, right? When you have law enforcement agencies talking with each other, things can go more smoothly, right? That's part of the pro for working together, but there's also places like San Francisco and many others that call themselves sanctuary places because then they're saying, if you're going to come in here, you're not getting any of our local help.
Yeah, but DeSantis is reversing that in Florida.
Well, of course.
And he deputized, he's asking the feds if they can deputize
Yeah.
lawyers, judges, some judges that can become immigration judges.
So yeah, we won't get into the present now, but yeah, there's a handful of things that our current governor would like to make sure we take the lead at the national level. Any questions on immigration history?
We'll be writing it for another 500 years.
Yeah, can we take a second to just, if someone wants to name, what's one takeaway you're taking away today?
History repeats, because it keeps happening. you know.
History repeats and it keeps happening,
You want to
good?
Stop it, but here it comes again,
Mm-hmm. What else? Thank you, Claudia. History repeats and it keeps happening. What else are we taking away today? Yes.
People have migrated for all sorts of reasons, ever since there were people on this earth.
Right.
And animals migrate, nature migrates.
Mhm.
And so therefore, we have to come up with a better way of organizing human life than borders that are not penetrable.
Yeah. And I think, so, and to make what you're saying a bit more, let's connect it a little bit to what we learned about in Old and New Testament, right? That the idea of borders weren't really a thing, right? There was the idea of like border cities, like your city would have a border, right? You would have these walls, right? That's why when you're walking up to Jerusalem, it says you see the city gates, where that's where the threshing floor happens, and that's where you would also see the crosses, by the way, would be at gates, so that you know before you walk in, don't be a usurper or an insurrection. That's your first warning and final one. Even in our own U.S. history, we don't have the idea of borders until down the road, once you start really forming more national identities even.
And
Right.
if you've never seen a US-Mexican border, I strongly suggest that you drive down and see it.
If you never
We
seen it,
did. When we went to Texas to see the eclipse, we went down to Eagle Pass.
so you can go down to the border, and if you've never seen it,
Took our breath away. It was so cruel. I mean, I just stood there crying. I was holding
It was
the
so
car.
it was so cruel.
Cruel.
Yeah.
It was so cruel. I mean, it cut
The wall.
and I mean, it was like it went past people's backyards. I mean, literally it went, here was the fence and there was the house. And can you imagine, and it was dead. Like there was no vibrant life. Absolutely no vibrant life. It's like the place was just dead.
Yeah, so no, I'll get to you, yes, I see your hand. I think this is where, if you're ever curious, look up like PCUSA and the border, like there's some really fun stuff that have happened, where even when a wall is so apparent and dehumanizing, the acts of worship can become an act of protest. There's been services that have happened at the border on either side. There's even an image of, they had a seesaw once where kids in the south and in the north of the border could play together. As we sang as our final hymn, in Christ there is north, east, or west, right? Our worship can become an act of protest, even at things like the wall, where they had communion services with a wall in the middle. My final sermon I did at in seminary for my senior sermon was on Acts at Pentecost, and I talked about dividing, walls coming down. And this was during the a higher immigration crisis again during that season. I actually had a wall, an actual wall, like a plank of wood, in front of the communion table, so that after the word proclaimed and we went to the table, the wall was then broken down. A reminder that these walls get broken down. Yeah.
I think if you look through everything you talked about, the basis of many of the immigration restrictions is fear.
Yeah.
You talked about justified fear
Yeah.
in one of your first services here.
Mhm.
And it was fear that caused the Red Scare after World War I. It was fear that caused the whole upheaval in the 50s. That was characterized as anti-communist. And the role of the federal government in all this, the role of the FBI and the FBI predecessors, J. Edgar Hoover through his history, was based upon fear.
Yeah. So fear.
I come from Western Pennsylvania, where the fear of the immigrants was great because it was going to dilute everything. They were going to take jobs. Well, there were so many jobs that the Frick Company would go to York and bring in an entire village. And it was beneficial to those people because they were stuck in Austria and they were being repressed there. It was job opportunities for those people. Their economics can explain so much of this. And it's the fear of what these people are going to be that those fears are unfounded.
Yes, yes.
How many jobs have been taken from people who are the most vociferous about immigration? How many jobs have been taken from those people? The answer is very few, in my opinion.
So what Don's sharing for those who are watching online is that when you look at this history, you see that part of what repeats is that it's fear-driven. Fear of based on different ethnicity, race, background, nationality, fear on losing jobs, fear of even crime, right? If you say, for example, that we're doing these things because immigrants create crime, the data shows that native-born Americans create more crime per capita than immigrants do. So a lot of these narratives, fear is a strong motivating tool, friends.
And it's one that is embraced by folks who are manipulators.
Yes, I mean, and friends, and I will say, not even our own scriptures, there are moments where people lead by fear, and we see God's rebuke at that afterwards, right? Yeah, there are moments that, like, you look at some of the kings that happen in Israel. When people, move and are led by fear, it's a human thing that happens, which is why in 1 John, I love it in 4:18. When we talk about loving God, loving neighbor, this is on your page 227 if you want to read it. That God is love. Let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. Whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. Right? That's at verse 7. At 4:18, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. For fear has to do with punishment, and whoever fears has not reached perfection in love. Right? Even the wisdom of some of the writers in the epistles recall that fear is something that repeats in every generation. And if we are people who are led by love, who are called to love, how does our perfect love found in Christ cast out fear? The narratives that people tell, and it's something that feels like you're having to put up a whole different kind of armor in this season when there's different narratives and what is truth, right? Who knows who says that? That's Pilate, right? What is truth in a season of media and social media, and I can get more TikTok views than people who watch a sermon here, right? It's crazy. Any other concluding thoughts?
I have a question.
Yes.
922-941-92-1597. I think that was the church phone number.
It still is.
Still is, yeah.
Can I still call that number?
You should be able to. So she's asking about the church number. For I want to say a week, you weren't able to call the church because we had to transfer our phone lines from the floodage at the Ammon building over here. We did get the company moved over. Frontier moved our lines over, our phone lines, and it worked for a day, and then they forgot to add it to our account, so then it dropped. So if you happen to call during that day, when you call now, it does go. We do have an active phone, so you should be able to call now.
That is the number, though.
That is a number.
Yeah.
So you
It
can.
it just kept ringing and nobody answered. And suddenly I thought, I heard that the administration
Yeah.
building was.
You can also in the directory. There's all our phone lines. We're working on getting a system.
It's the only one I could remember.
Yeah.
I was.
We're going to keep that phone number. Yes. And we're looking at a system where when you call friends, they'll actually, if you want to get directed to Alex, it could possibly just call my cell. If you know about what is it called? Cat phones. like you actually need the CAT module to be brought over from the admin building here for our old phones to currently work, so we're looking at a new system.
So what is your number?
The number's still the same. Oh, my number. I can give you my number
I'll
when,
try it
it's
when
on
we
a
go
directory.
home, and if it doesn't work.
but I won't give it while we're live streaming.
Sunday.
And number blew up.
Any other questions?
I just think that even though I agree with you, it's totally fear driven, these actions, but we have to, but fear is such a gut reaction. A lot of people, we don't have control over fear unless we learn to control it. So that's the hard part. And a lot of people have a hard time controlling fear. They want to control I noticed that with my mother, who was, she had no fear of dying because she knew where she was going. But she had fear that the world was changing.
Yeah.
And so that was a valid fear in her.
Yeah, so
And so we have to acknowledge that. That's all I'm saying. We have to really acknowledge people who are fearful.
thank you, Trudy. And I think, so fear is a human thing, right? My son,
Very natural.
you know, being next to 9 feet of a pool water, I hope will one day become afraid not to just step in. Fear is evolutionary, right? You see something roaring and you're like, maybe I don't go into that cave, right? Fear is a human survival instinct.
But you want knowledge to replace fear.
You want love to replace fear, yeah.
But if you
Don't go
have-
pet a lion in the
You
cave
have to
though.
guard against unjustified fear.
Unjustified
And
fear.
that is a constant thing.
Yes.
And we constantly have to be vigilant about that,
Did you want to say something,
because
Judy?
that's what
Fear can be
sent
protected from
everybody down the
irrational
chute.
fear.
I just want everyone to know that I'm gonna hang around until it ends.
Irrational.
I'm going to hang around until it ends.
Good.
Ah, that's it.
Good.
That's it. Remember.
All right,
Another portion of fear, I think from the King and I, you have to be carefully taught.
Yes.
So children, it's
Mhm.
parents and children and parents and children, and does it, what gets handed down in the mindset, in the,
Say that last part again. What
what gets handed down?
What gets handed down? Back to what Claudia was saying, it repeats.
Right,
This is why we're all, and Bible scholars say this all the time, the text you have in this book that we call the Holy Bible are narratives that people shared over time, and they were oral people until they became written people, right? And then those stories were still then orally shared, right? Treat the foreigner, for you were once in Egypt, right? So they tell these stories, as you heard in that first class, because it's what we pass down. If we forget to tell our kids, you know, even churches who did, you know, immigrant activism like ours in the 80s, and we forget to tell those stories often, we'll forget that part of our narrative identity, right? Our children, the people we interact with. And sometimes it's a remembering. Gosh, that comes up often with me because that is what it is, to be remembered, to remember the stories of who we are, to be remembered in Jesus, right?
And sometimes that combats fear because we remember we've been here before
We've been here
and we
before.
learned how to survive it. And
Yeah.
we not only survived it, we learned how to thrive after that fear.
How not to just survive in the midst of fear, how to thrive after. Should we end in prayer? Gracious and loving God, we thank you that in Jesus Christ, in you are indeed love. Lord, help us perfect a love that casts out fear. Help us, Lord, to not only love you, but also to discern how we love our neighbor in a way, Lord, that breaks down walls, that repeats the good elements of history, Lord, that indeed is a witness to the life and the love we find in your holy name. Lord, be with us as we go into either lunches with family or lunch at home, whether we're ready for our afternoon nap, or maybe who's going to make the conference finals. Lord, wherever we may be going, may your presence be with us. Surround us with a presence of comfort and of peace, one that is beyond understanding. Lord, we ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you, friends.
Trudy, I have those words in a special place at home.